Welcome this afternoon. My name is Dan Marquette. I'm a volunteer dog walker at Austin Pets Alive. I'd like to welcome you to the Build Resilience and Excitement Around Change panel. I'd like to have you join me in welcoming the members of our panel. We have Tawny Hammond, the Midwest Region Director at Best Friends Animal Society. We have Theresa Johnson, the Executive Director at the Kansas City Pet Project. Also is Cheryl Schneider, the Director of Animal Services at Williamson County Animal Care. We have Leanne Shenefeld, the South Central Regional Director at Best Friends. And Shelly Thompson, the Director of Grants at Maddie's Fund.
All right, thanks everybody. I have the distinct pleasure of being able to moderate this team of rock stars up here who have been through tons of changes in their careers, managed through a lot of different difficulties. So I'm going to kind of start. Do you want to start down at the end there, Tawny? Have you introduced yourself? What your brief career history is, and share with us one example of a change that you had to manage through, and like what worked and what didn't. Briefly.
Sure. Yeah, and happy to. And actually, what I'm doing now with Best Friends, and I don't call it Hoover, I call it WOVA. I like WO better. My WOVA. I'm actually the National Director of Leadership Advancement with Best Friends, so I'm doing a lot of leadership work right now. I know. Let's hear it for ELC. So, I was in municipal service for the majority of my career, about 30 years, primarily in parks, and been in animal welfare probably about 8 years. And I was the director in Fairfax County of the animal shelter. It's Northern Virginia. And then in Austin here for a couple of years. And then I've been with Best Friends. It's a Midwest director. It's got my old title. And then now working on leadership around the United States and developing a certification, leadership certification program, which is pretty cool. I think you want to change, right? Something we worked through. So one change. So basically both, whether I was in Fairfax or Austin, was just eliminating this notion that shelter pets are different than pets in homes, and the whole behavioral component that was just we knew scientifically and data-wise it didn't work, and that was really hard to stop that. And believe it or not, when I came to Austin, they still had a person focused on that, and they had a special room with no windows, with all of these test things like a toddler, stuffed animals, the hand, and really tried to elicit bad behaviors and made death decisions on that, or even behaviors in the kennel. So getting the staff to stop thinking like that. Fairfax, same thing. I went to a research symposium in Dallas, very first thing we did when I started in Fairfax County, and Dr. Amy Martyr and Dr. Emily Weiss, and there were some other experts from around the nation international studies done that it is not a predictor of behavior outside the kennel or the shelter. So they're very stressed. And so I went back, tried to change that, and it was really difficult. And I used science, and I used data, and I used facts, and I talked about best practices, and I name dropped Dr. Amy Martyr and Emily Weiss and explained it. And people just cling to what they want to cling to because they felt that it was their job to cull the herd, and that these pets, if they're homeless, something was wrong with them. And the thing that I just wanted to share with you all, in the end, some people got on board with it and it made sense to them, and others it made them feel really comfortable and they fought it. I think the thing is that always remember that pets, I don't care what they are, chickens, roosters, companion animals, we're talking usually about cats and dogs, but wildlife, whatever, they shouldn't have to fight for their life. They're not trained for it, and neither are we. I volunteered in a homeless shelter, and I remember the fights that would break out over toothpaste. These are things high-value items that people would normally never fight about if they were in the comfort of their own home. And so the same thing with pets, high-value items. So if you're still doing behavior stuff, please look at the latest research. But that was a tough one, and in the end, we got on board and we stopped doing that, and a lot of pets stopped fighting for their lives, and they could just be pets.
Hi, my name is Leanne Shannon. I'm currently the South Central Regional Director for Best Friends Animal Society. My resume is going to sound very similar to Tani's. We have worked on and off together for the last 15 plus years. She hired me when I was 20. So we have a long record together. But my entree into animal welfare happened in 2013 when I was hired as one of the assistant directors at the Fairfax County Animal Shelter in Fairfax County, Virginia. It's Northern Virginia, very suburban county. And then from Fairfax, I went to become the deputy director in Austin, Texas, and then was the longtime interim director before I left for Best Friends. One of the things that became very apparent to us quickly when we started in Fairfax was that it was already an organization in flux. The organization was coming out of a period of a lot of negative publicity, had made a bad director hire, had put somebody else in place who had started making changes, and they were looking for a team to continue moving that shelter forward in its life-saving journey. And so one of the things we had to implement was an overhaul of the adoption process. Previously, the adoption counselors had really seen their role in adoptions as, being the people with the power to say no. It was the complete antithesis in some ways of what open adoptions are supposed to be. And so they saw that role and that sort of perceived power as the way to protect pets and to protect public safety. But it wasn't doing anything to get pets into homes. It wasn't doing anything to enhance the reputation and the relationship of the shelter with the community. And we also know now that a more open adoption process is the way to make better matches, the way to help our community be the kind of pet owners we all want to see. And one of the things that was so surprising about that change to me is how people move through the phases of change. It's really very much like the way people move through grief. You have the people who are going to deny that it's happening and fight it and hope that they wake up the next day and it's something different. And you have people who react with anger, and you have people who react as though they've lost something, even though in my mind what they were gaining was a way to work with people, a way to build relationships with people. And so that was a very important professional lesson that I was learning, even though I was already well into a decade of my public service career. And so the strategies that you use for each of those, you have team strategies to help teams move through change, but you can't ignore the individuals.
Cheryl Snyder, Director of Williamson County Regional Animal Shelter. I spent 32 years as an ER nurse, paramedic, and EMS director, and then moved into animal welfare at some point in that time. So I'm kind of used to, I kind of like thrive on change and stress, obviously. But some of the things that in Williamson County that we did recently was we just remodeled our shelter, did a huge renovation, and added a new building expansion. We made the decision at the county level to move all of the dogs from our current location into a show barn across town and operate out of the show barn for 6 months so they could do the renovation and the expansion at the same time, thus saving about $500,000 and cutting 6 months off of the construction of the new shelter. Plus, if we would have waited for the new building to be built, we would have ended up with 48 dog kennels for an intake of 350 a month. So we made that decision, and it was very stressful on all the employees and dogs and staff and volunteers. So the thing I would say is that while many of you are probably used to stress and change, that your employees and volunteers are not. So it's important to explain everything along the way, listen to their concerns when things happen, and help them get through it. But listening is very important. So, and then action after listening. So you don't just leave them behind. You can't just say, this is what we're going to do, and this is, I don't want to hear anything about it. So explaining everything, having a plan, so they all know the plan. So that would be my advice about change. And everybody has changes in their shelters.
Hi, I'm Theresa Johnson. I'm the CEO, Executive Director, and Chief Life-Saving Officer at Kansas City Pet Project. So I run the open admission municipal shelter for the city of Kansas City, and we take in about 10,500 animals a year. One of the things that happened most recently is, so we've been a no-kill shelter, no-kill community for about 7 years. And last year was the first time that we were able to really implement a full intake diversion program for cats. And so we've been a life-saving shelter for cats. We haven't euthanized a cat for space, I don't even know, maybe close to the entire time we've been there. And so we realized that we wanted to have an intake diversion program. And I thought, well, this is going to be great and everybody's going to love this. And our staff and volunteers lost their minds because they had gotten so used to the fact that we were a life-saving shelter for cats that they started to believe that cats were better off in our shelter than they were back out in their community. And so we had a lot of volunteers in particular that were really upset with the fact that we were talking to people as they were bringing in cats, helping them understand that these cats were better off back in their communities and giving them the resources they needed to help them put their cats back out in the community, because these volunteers and some of our staff really believed that we should be taking these cats in and finding them new homes instead of putting them back out there. And there was a lot of fear and irrational, thinking that we were turning away injured or ill cats, and really we had to spend a lot of time sitting down with staff and volunteers. We had meetings with the volunteers and really helped them understand exactly the benefits that the resources that we use in keeping cats in shelters and being able to help more cats by actually putting more cats out in the community is the right thing to do. It took a while, and I think we probably even lost a few volunteers, but in the end, we all came to be on the same page, and we're doing some great things now with our intake diversion program. But I realize that you assume that a change that you're going to put in is going to be great and that everyone is going to just automatically get on board, and that's not always the case. And so it's really important that you lay out your plan, a lot of what everyone else has said, that you really put your plan out there, make sure that everyone understands what you're trying to achieve, what the goal is, and how they can help and be a part of those changes along the way.
Thank you. So your comment there about, expecting everyone just to be immediately on board, usually whenever we try to, enact change, we're expecting everyone just to be like, oh yeah, this sounds great, let's do it, and be immediately on board. Unfortunately, we often get met with people who just want to argue and fight and push back and are very resistant to that change. So how do you each motivate your staff to want the change?
I think real quickly, people trying to identify with what makes them tick and why they come to work and what's special to them. The thing we have to remember about in animal services is that some people need to move on, that they've done everything they possibly can, and because sheltering is changing, right? Instead of maybe life being a possibility or an outcome, we're flipping that, and that sheltering, every pet deserves a chance at life. There's many that have developed some really complex coping mechanisms to get by, and maybe it's time for them to volunteers as well, find an organization that better fits their values, because they're just going to be a constant fight of values, coping mechanisms, history, justifications, motivations. So I think finding what makes people tick, talking to them about their values and what makes them happy, making sure they're in the right seat. If you've read any of Collins' books, From Good to Great, are they in the right seat on the right bus? Sometimes they need to change buses. So that's a big one that we keep fighting. We try to save all the employees and turn them into true believers. Science and data sometimes really work, and sometimes it doesn't work at all because it's been absent so long in our field. Guessing breeds has been a responsibility even when we're wrong. Doing things that we know aren't based in science, but it feels right or we believe it. And then I also think appealing to people's sense of wanting to be the best. People want to be part of winning teams. And if you explain to them why we're doing what we're doing, and this is really a good thing, and it's a feather in the cap of our town or our city or our county or our nonprofit, those are the things you can do. And if it doesn't work, though, I don't think we should spin our wheels too much. Sometimes you do need to have a change of people that are working in the organization, and it's healthy. All the big companies that have survived, if you do read Good to Great and some of the other books that he's written, do go through this metamorphosis and change, and sometimes have to change with leadership or staff. So that's not really that horrible of a thing if people aren't happy in their position.
I think that we underestimate the role that fear plays in how people get on board with change or not. One of the most impactful management books to me is a book called Managing Transitions. And it's so impactful, I can't remember the author, so I can't tell you. But you can look it up. It's a skinny blue book. But there was a particular chart that really resonated with me that showed a bell curve. And so if you think about change of getting, it's like thinking about change as getting across this chasm. So at one point, you have a team that feels like they really know what they're doing. They feel that they have the skills and the resources they need to be at this point. And then you're telling them to get to the other side of that change and be at that point where they know exactly what they're doing and they feel really confident in doing that. But in reality, what happens is you see... Yes, that book is white though. Okay. But as you go across that, there's a fall off in confidence. There's a fall off in knowledge. People don't know what to do. They don't know how to get to that other side. And so as you're thinking about how you lead your organization through, you have to figure out like what that bridge looks like to get people across that chasm where they don't have confidence in the vision or the results that are expected, and they don't have confidence in their own skills and in being able to successfully work in that way.
So we've been talking about how to get your staff and volunteers on board. What about your community, the outside of the shelter walls? How do you get them to be on board with any changes that you're making?
I think for us it's been to share what we're trying to do with the community. So, and we've talked a lot this weekend about transparency. Transparency is very important, and helping your community understand what it is you're trying to achieve and sharing not only the successes but your challenges and sometimes your failures too. So I think we do a lot of sharing of what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve, our data, helping people understand where we're trying to move the organization to or our programs to. And I think that helps the community understand what that change looks like and helps them get on board quicker with what you're trying to achieve.
I think the community's a lot easier than your staff. The community, if you do good things, they're going to support you. But I do think you have to get out there and tell them what you're going to do, and you have to be sincere, and they know if you're not sincere or not. Personally, I'm active on almost every Facebook page there is for lost and found animals. Everybody knows, they tag me all the time. Everybody knows who the shelter director is in Williamson County. And so they feel a personal connection to the shelter because of being active. So I think you have to really engage your community, but you also have to be engaged. You can't just go to work and close the door and not be engaged. So to be engaged, you also have to know what is really going on in your shelter. And you can't also do that by sitting behind a desk all day long. So, for me personally, I make rounds. I know many of the dogs by name, and as they change over, I walk a dog every morning for a mile, and that dog stays in my office for the morning. So you have to, you have to show that your employees and volunteers and community that you are engaged and you are involved.
I just wanted to add on to that briefly. We used the word engagement because I think Cheryl makes a great point. We used the word engagement in a very deliberate way in Austin. And engagement to us meant that we were having a conversation, and that conversation was meant to build a relationship. I think too often what we do in sheltering is we give people a message. We're, more outreach focused. We're making statements and not listening to what people have to say back to us. And so part of that communication for your community needs to be really listening, and also to your staff and volunteers needs to be really listening about what the concerns are, and being willing to take in other information and have some of those difficult conversations.
The only thing I wanted to add is that I think, too, we need to redefine community, because on our social media platforms, I think community stops for us, like in our volunteer program and our adopters and people that come to the shelter. And there are so many people out there that if they knew what we were about and they knew more about what happened within the walls or what the animal protection or animal control officers did, that they would rally, whether they loved animals or not or had them in their home, that it resonated with them, that if it was part of, I don't have kids in school currently, but I will fight for good public schools because I know it's part of crime prevention. It's the right thing to do. I have an ethical responsibility. I'm part of a greater good. I mean, there's all these things that roll into wanting to do things that benefit other people, but people often think of the animal shelter as benefiting animals. And I don't know, statistically, this is an old statistic that 25 to 35% of people go into a shelter or a rescue to get their pet, and the rest of them are getting them elsewhere. And I think a big part of that is we are not reaching the community. We're reaching the same people over and over, and we're worried. If we talk about burnout and compassion fatigue, well, we're kind of being part of it, because social media, it's super limited. And I think reaching people, being participatory with libraries and parks, health department, the fire department, the police department, faith-based organizations, because animal issues, we know economically, the University of Denver study, that $157 million was pumped into the Austin, Traverse City economy over 6 years because of the no-kill commitment. And Google moved one of their operations campuses here in Austin specifically because of Austin's pet policies and commitment to no-kill. So there's huge benefits. And then what about diverse populations? We talked about, look around the room, I mean, most everybody in here, white, predominantly women. And if we want to see people of color and other ethnicities, nationalities, diversities come into our organizations as employees and volunteers, we absolutely have to connect with our communities. What Leanne said about listening to them and really being relevant. And we're busy, we're strapped. A lot of us don't have the time and the energy to get out there and do that, but we can do it through working with other agencies. Think about it, family services, domestic violence, child services, and wellness, the wellness components of it. So I think that's the next frontier, where we're really gonna have a place at the table, not begging for scraps and pieces of a budget, because we are a huge component of wellness, and it's a community ethic. And right now, we got to get out of that niche. We got to get out of the animal niche, because it's really a people issue. Thank you.
Tony, you mentioned, compassion fatigue, and so I'm going to switch us over, kind of change direction a little bit over to the resilience part of the title of this talk. Being in animal welfare, we deal with a lot of stress, attacks, constant state of crisis with full shelters, things like that. How do you deal with getting attacks on a regular basis, with constantly being in that state of crisis? What is that resilience piece that you guys have all worked on with yourselves and with your staff?
Alcohol and retirement. No, I mean, seriously. So being in EMS for a long time, we, obviously there's a lot of critical incidents. And so I think Paula mentioned in her talk yesterday that they have started a peer group. And that is a hope of mine in animal welfare too, because honestly, the stress I feel in this job is nothing compared to what I felt in the ER or in the back of an ambulance ever. So it's a different kind of stress, and it's like a sustained stress. And so I think that in times of crisis, like for instance what Paula went through, and I'm sure others of you have gone through, people complain, make a big deal out of something, somebody in your shelter gets hurt very badly, it affects everybody. I had an employee that got hurt very badly in our shelter, and I had a psychologist come in and meet with other employees as they wanted to. Obviously, we offer an EAP because employee EAP? Yeah, because we are a government agency. But I think that's very important in this business. And I hope to see in the future, much like EMS, fire, and police have, a peer group program is called CISD program in the emergency services, where when there is an incident in a shelter, that a group of peers from another place can come in and sit down and hold a debriefing and be there to help people get through that kind of stuff. You do have to, in this job, look into yourself a lot and think about, what stress can you handle and how you're going to get through it. And for me, like if there's the biggest stress for me is space. I mean, that's the biggest stress, is when I feel like I'm against the wall and I have too many dogs, usually it's dogs, and I don't know what to do with them. And so I'll fret about it and not sleep for a couple of nights, and then all of a sudden I'm like, we got this, we're going to do it. So, people deal with stress in different ways, but I do think in this business that there needs to be something further in the future.
I think that, as Cheryl was saying, some of you all who are part of a smaller organization or part of a smaller nonprofit and think that you can't access psychological resources, think about your community partners. One of the things we did in Austin is we reached out to our partners in EMS who have a very well-developed peer support system and on-call psychologists because of some really horrible things that had happened in their department with suicide. And so they recognized that there was a need to enhance their mental health resources. And they were a very willing partner when we reached out to them and explained that the type of critical and acute stress that our staff and volunteers experience in some of those situations. I think the other thing that is important in just developing general resiliency is that we need to be mindful of the impact of language. And so as leaders, we need to be very deliberate in the words we choose, because the words we choose create mental constructs. So they're how we think about problems, and how you think about problems or how you think about solutions. And they, help define how people react to situations. So when your shelter is full, it's a crisis every single time, that becomes very, very stressful. So think about another way to phrase being at population capacity so you can differentiate between when your shelter is functioning and full versus when you are truly at a crisis. Because when you talk about emergency language and you're talking as though you're in a constant state of emergency, that's very, very stressful to your teams.
Yep. That's really, really important, the language that we use. I know sometimes we're talking about kill, euthanasia, and I always just talked about humanely ending a pet's life if it wasn't truly euthanasia. And so there's different words you can use in taking care of your team and being at capacity. We were at capacity frequently. And but there was a reason for that, and it wasn't an emergency. It's like people that come into the ER and they work there every day. They don't get caught up with their work either. Neither do social workers or teachers or ministers. There's lots of fields that deal with really hard things, so we're not alone. I'm not saying we shouldn't have feelings, but sometimes I think that we feel super alone and there's nobody else that feels the tragedy and the pain and the suffering and deal with vulnerable populations. I do think we need to start taking better care of ourselves. I'm really alarmed at because I'm focused on my own personal health and what I've done to myself through my life with maybe not so great coping mechanisms, cheating myself of the exercise that I craved, or whether I've got, I don't smoke, and it's something I'm glad I don't do, because it's just one other thing I don't have to worry about. I'm with my friend down here, retirement and martinis, and but taking care of ourselves and self-care, we model that for our staff and our employees to take care of ourselves so we can live to fight another day. The one thing I did want to say is my friend and colleague, and she's in the Executive Leadership Certification Program, the Best Friends Program that I'm heading up right now, is we are working on a mental health project, and that's Northern Kentucky University, and so we're working on that, and the survey's closed, but we are doing something on this because it's not just compassion fatigue. We're talking about resiliency, Shelly. It's also decision fatigue, ethics fatigue, happy fatigue. Good stress is hard too, believe it or not, really hard. And so it's not just sadness, it's all kinds of other things. It's almost a misnomer. So if you're interested in resiliency, see Megan, raise your hand, Megan. We're working on a project that I think is going to be a game changer in animal welfare.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I came from the corporate world. I worked for JP Morgan for years, and this is a much more stressful business than the corporate investment world I came from. And this business is 24/7. And it also attracts sensitive people. And so we have to give our staff tools to be able to cope with just everything that goes on 24/7 in our businesses. And so we actually brought in someone who taught our staff mindfulness training. And so it was really helpful for our staff to have some tools that they could use, and even little cards and things that they could put on their desk every day, and that we could all remind each other when things got tough to use some of those tools to be able to give it a minute and think through and put those thoughts out there that are worrying you and bothering you, and just being able to have ways to cope with some of the things that happen to us. And you're right, it's not just bad things, it's also, stress is good things as well, and just the amount of activity that we deal with every single day, 365 days a year. And so I think just being able to do some of those things for your staff and your volunteers to give them ways to cope with our industry is really helpful.
Thank you. What questions do you all have? We've got a few minutes left for questions if you'd like.
Hi, my name's Nina Wager. I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And one of the ladies at the very end, you mentioned that you're part of is it University of Utah, the program? Yes. Do you have any information on that program? Because I've been trying to get some, and I think y'all are still mapping out.
We're still mapping it out, but we're actually designing a course called Contemporary Animal Services. It'll be a certificate program online. And Carolyn, can you look on Southern Utah University Best Friends, do a search? Carolyn, right here, raise your hand, Carolyn. I'll give you the website after this.
Okay.
And I don't know it by heart yet.
Do you know about how much the program? It's an online program, correct?
I think it's about $498. You get a certificate from the university.
Okay.
I think you got to look, but it's really affordable.
Okay, good.
I'm actually getting my master's program through the university about a third of the cost that it would be online. And it'll be the first degree in the country in contemporary animal services. First university degree that's focused on life-saving and ending the killing of pets in shelters.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm Diane Lubert, and I'm a city commissioner for South Texas, a small town in South Texas. And how did y'all get your elected officials on board? Because I'm having a hell of a time getting my co-commissioners on board with this.
She said the session after this is on that, but I will tell you that for most counties and cities, that if you are doing good and they don't get complaints, they don't care what you do.
On that note, thank you all very much for attending this session, and thank you, ladies.